Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I'm your host, Steve Bissell. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in therapy. I also talk to guests about therapy, their experience with therapy, and how psychology is present in many places in their lives. I also share personal stories. So please join me on this journey about therapy. Hi, and welcome to episode 91 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am Steve Bissell. If you haven't listened to episode 90, it's a little bit of me talking about my history, particularly working with the criminal/community justice field. So hopefully you can go listen to that and know more about where I come from in regards to my work. But on episode 91, we're going to talk to Marc Sholes. Marc Sholes is a New York psychotherapist with 35 years of experience helping people get healthy, tidy up their world, and straighten up their lives. He is the author of the book, Reset Your Romantic GPS, Why You Steer Towards the Wrong Partners and How to Change for the Better, which is available at all bookstores, and it will be attached in my show notes. So if you want to go and buy it, that would be great. It talks about attachment style, psychological force we develop in early childhood, and the influence of every emotional choice and decision we make. Marc areas of expertise include couples therapy, marital challenges, anxiety, depression, employment difficulties, sexual dysfunction, and eating disorders. He's also a board member of the National Institute for Psychotherapies, a leading training institute for psychotherapists, and a former associate editor of Psychoanalytic Perspectives, a journal of integration and innovation. I'm looking forward to our conversation because attachment styles is something I really enjoy. So let's get to it. Hi, and welcome to episode 91 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I'm Steve Bissell. It's also YouTube channel, episode 25. I'm going to stop putting those episodes. I've been around long enough on YouTube at this point, but please go check it out. Sometimes it's nice to have the visual with it. But I have Marc Sholes here today. Marc is someone that was referred to me, and I started listening to his stuff online, whether it is his own website and everything else that he's done, like including podcasts. And I found it fascinating. So I'm happy to have him around. He's written a book. He's going to, I'm sure he's going to talk about it. And it's nice to have a fellow Northeasterner around. So welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. Really excited to be talking with you on your podcast, which I happen to think is terrific.
Well, thank you so much. And I've listened to you to other podcasts. It's funny because I do pre-interviews with pretty much everyone. And what I've come up with is I was like, I have so many questions based upon what I heard on other podcasts. So can't wait to talk with Marc about that. But Marc, I look you up, obviously, and research you. You obviously send me some stuff, but maybe my audience doesn't know who you are. So maybe you can tell me about yourself.
Yeah, I'm in Manhattan. I'm a psychotherapist and a psychoanalyst, and I've been practicing for what feels like ever, for about 35 years. I do a lot of couples work and a lot of individual work. I see clients from college age all the way through end of life stage. So I've been really sort of breathing, sleeping, and studying psychotherapy for most of my adult life. I got into it really because, which precedes my adult life, I was born with a kind of empathic disposition, and my mom, who was a very interesting, charismatic, kind of volatile and mood shifting kind of person, needed some counseling, and my father seemed to not want to take that role on. So I felt like sort of I'd been counseling from very early on, which made me a good therapist. But as a human in relationships, it kind of made things more complicated for me as being a caretaker from very early on. So I've been doing it really, I think, since I'm born.
Yeah, one of the things I tell people all the time, they ask me, how long have you been doing this? I said, professionally, about 23 years. If you count my family, 47.
Exactly.
So I relate to what you're saying. And the first thing that came to mind when you said 35 years, my God, that's a long time to keep empathy for that long. Well, we can come back to it, but it's like being empathetic for that stuff is like, see a lot of burnout going on right now with a lot of therapists.
Yeah.
So you talked about it a little bit in regards to your family, but what was your journey to get into the mental health field? How did you get here?
I mean, I got here probably because I also started my own being a patient around my sophomore year in college, being involved in a relationship that sort of took me for a ride that I was, obviously a participant in, and just really kind of being lost in that kind of relationship. So I started therapy at about 19 and studied psychology in school. And it was really, I was just very much, I was determined I knew that sort of there was something that wasn't kosher with me in terms of my relationships. I was really a caretaker. I was really privileging other people's needs. I really didn't know what my own needs were. And when I did know them, I was sort of ashamed to express them. I knew this was not right. And I was determined to switch things around. And I think my interest in the field and my helping people kind of do the same thing I was attempting to do for myself all kind of came together and led me into the field. And I think continues.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think what people I love the most having on this podcast is people who continue to educate themselves way past their educational end, so to speak. And that's
Yeah.
what I get from a lot of what you're saying. And relationships, such a key thing to discuss, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that come up for me is attachment style.
Yeah.
And so I know a lot of the attachment styles, obviously, but I'm not as well versed as you, nor will I pretend I am. But it would be nice if we can share with people listening a little bit more about the attachment styles, because that's going to come up with a whole lot of different questions. Believe me, I have like 20 more questions, obviously, just based on the first few minutes.
Yeah. And once you start looking into attachment style, you'll find it popping up. It's really become a more popular and kind of understood theory and science. But basically, we're born with we grow up in an early milieu, our parents and our caretakers, and there's a kind of language that develops, and it's a language of attachment and connection. And there are two basic kinds of languages during those kind of pre-verbal years, which are kind of a secure attachment and an insecure attachment. And very quickly, it's kind of easy to understand how a secure attachment develops. It develops like this. The infant comes into the world with basic needs of hunger and need for touch, need for soothing, need for for regulation. And a good enough caretaker responds to those needs in consistent enough ways. And the child internalizes two things that are really crucial. One, my needs are okay, and two, the world will respond to them. And after thousands of these relational moments, the child begins to internalize this sense of safety, this sense that I'm existing in a safe enough world and my needs are going to pretty much get met. And I can tolerate things that don't get met because I can kind of begin to think that they will eventually get met. And so that security that the child then goes out into the world with is a real game changer because they can anticipate things aren't going to collapse. They can go through the obstacles of life, the difficulties of life, the complexness of relationships, and they can figure out what's good for them and what's not good for them. If something's not good for them, they can leave it. If they want to challenge themselves, they have a sense of, I can challenge myself, and if I fail, it doesn't mean I'm a loser and unlovable. And that is the gift of a secure attachment. And on the flip side of that, an insecure attachment, of course, is the child comes in the same way, but those needs are very seldomly met or very inconsistently met. Or the parents are so self absorbed that they really are not even kind of responding to the child's needs. And so what happens is two kind of tragic things. One is the child begins to experience their needs as there's something wrong with my needs. And
Okay.
two, they begin to be preoccupied with the other, with the caretaker, because now the onus of the relationship and attachment is on the child. How do I connect to them So, how do I accommodate myself to what they're comfortable with in order to feel tethered, in order to feel attached? And attached is the most important motivator for an infant. We need to be connected. Connectivity is number one. And so there's a language that develops with an insecure attachment, which is I'm connected through to you through my own accommodating myself to you.
Hmm.
And that's how one is in control of their attachment needs. And so the security, instead of it being inside, now is outside. So think about going into the world where you don't have that internalized life jacket, but that life jacket is residing in the other. And in order for you to
Right.
feel stabilized, you need to be kind of consistently connected to that other, whoever that other is, your partner, your boss, your friends. And so security becomes really the number one motivation, and the ability to really kind of choose for oneself, or to kind of privilege their own sense of self. That's not a gift that the more insecurely attached person has. So that's sort of the languages, the styles.
It's interesting. The couple of things came to mind when I was listening to that. I do a lot of trauma work, and all I can think of is the fawn response that has been more and more reported in the trauma realm. And that's really that insecure attachment. I got to meet other people's needs in order to be happy,
Yeah, in order to feel even safe,
safe.
in order to feel secure. Happy, I think, is already it's something that rarely gets achieved, but the potential for happy exists in that.
So I really came up with the fawn response when I was thinking about the trauma. So I appreciate you telling me
Yeah,
that. The other thing too that came up in my head listening to that is like the type of parenting styles that people would have: authoritarian, authoritative, or permissive. And I'm wondering if that plays also a factor in regards to these attachment styles, because this definitely seems to be related, in my opinion.
yeah. You mean in terms of the parent themselves or parenting?
Yeah. So if you have an authoritative parent, it's giving child, and what I tell about authoritative, I describe it as enough cord to kind of like hang yourself, but not let you hang. But and to me, that's the best way to parent in many ways, and that creates a secure attachment. If you're in trouble, we're going to go and help you. But if you're not in trouble and you want to explore, you can. And I don't know if that plays a factor or not. And I wanted to hear your opinion as to how that probably plays a factor in the secure versus insecure attachment.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, we what's interesting is that grown-ups also have their attachment styles, right? So if a parent has, let's say, an avoidant attachment style, which means emotions and vulnerability is something that feels frightening to a person with an avoidant, or a parent with an avoidant attachment style. The vulnerability in the child is something that's not going to be responded to well. It's going to be responded to in a way where the child should be, let's make it all right. Get out of that state.
Right.
That's, you have to tough it up. Go out there and so the style of a parent is often going to very much affect the attunement to the child. And children come in with different constitutions also. So ultimately, any really rigid style of a parent is going to be not so attuned to the infant, right? And
Right.
so the more flexible a grown up is in their ability to kind of notice their own emotional experiences, the more attuned they're going to be able to be to the infant. So there's certainly times where a more authoritarian parent will be the more attuned response, but there could also very well be a lot of moments where that's not the right response.
Right.
And again, we're talking about good enough, you know, good enough parenting. I mean, this is not, no one bats 1,000, but good enough means consistent enough, responsive enough.
Right. And I think that with today's information overload that we have as parents, I've always reminded people that good enough, you can hit 80% of the time, and that's pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
But there's a lot of perfectionism, like, oh, once I got upset and I yelled, yeah, welcome to the club.
Yeah, yeah, 100%, 100%.
And I think that that plays a factor also as you as a parent and when you're developing your relationship with your child and how you're going to have that attachment style. Because then if you're beating yourself up, you're not paying attention to the child and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
When I think about all that too, is that, some people will say, well, if I grew up with having an insecure attachment, I'm stuck with that for the rest of my life. Right.
yeah,
And
yeah.
would you agree with that? Or do you think that things can change?
No, I would 100% say things can change, but they can't change without self awareness. They can't change without learning about one style and then making some choices that are different
Hmm.
and often uncomfortable. I like to say, there's the discomfort of healthy choices when you're in something that's not good for you. And there's a hope or a fantasy that if you could just get it right, then the person will love you. And you realize that that's not going to happen. The ability to leave and
Right.
to live with and mourn the feelings that come up that make you want to run right back, but the ability to kind of move in the opposite direction and live with the feelings that one has to sort of feel in order to take care of the self.
Something you're not used to sometimes when you've been insecure. So
Totally.
I think I go back to therapy in general. I think that if you're not conscious of what is going wrong with you and you don't have a willingness to change, which I think is a twofold approach in my work anyway.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's what you're talking about because I think that we can talk about it till we're blue in the face. If the other person's like, nope, not changing, what can we do?
Yeah, that's true. It takes awareness and it takes the will to change. And, if you've come up against that wall enough, hopefully, you say, okay, this is enough. It's kind of like even with addiction. You have to say, this is it. You have to come to a kind of, aha moment where you say, all right, if I continue this, I am going to get the exact same outcome. I'm going to continue to respond to what might feel like this is a little like chemistry in a relationship, where chemistry is just kind of an old pattern being sort of ignited, and the hope that you can maybe find somebody who's not available to be available. That can be a chemistry moment.
Right.
A lot of my clients, friends, when they're faced with a kind of a healthy relationship, somebody who is responsive and attuned and present, they will kind of often say, well, I just don't feel that spark. And I'll say, yeah, because that spark is something that you associate with a challenge, not necessarily a healthy attunement. They're two different beasts.
100%. It's funny because I've had that too. This person is great, whatever gender, it doesn't matter to me. I'm really bored.
Yeah,
And I'm like, okay, that's probably an attachment issue. Let's talk about that a little bit.
yeah,
So I obviously bring it up a little bit in my work, but obviously there's different types of insecure attachments, right?
yeah.
Do you think that you treat them differently or not?
Well, there are different types. And so, for instance, like I'm just looking, so in an ambivalent kind of attachment, there's a desire for closeness and a fear of rejection,
Mhm.
right? And with a more anxious or preoccupied attachment, there's kind of a constant need to seek reassurance and a preoccupation of the other. And with a more avoidant attachment, this is where you get more into kind of a one night stand kind of person or somebody who criticizes their partner for always being needy, sort of someone who disowns their own needs because their needs are so anxiety producing for them. So, in all of these cases, the first step, again, is to learn about and to become aware that what my book is about is a sort of GPS, right? So, there's in us a kind of GPS in terms of being drawn to certain kinds of people.
Right.
And we are familiar with those kinds of attachment styles. So even if something is dysregulating, it is what home was like.
Mm-hmm.
And we all want to go home. I mean, for better or for worse, until that sense of knowing something, that safety, even if it's a dysregulated place, is more safe for people than a safe place at times that, or a regulating place that is unfamiliar. Anyway, I don't know if I said that right, but
I know, I get what you're saying. I go back to
yeah,
the cycle of violence, people who stay with
yes,
partners that are abusive. And
right,
anyway, people say, well, why did they stay? That's terrible. Well, it's because that's
right,
what they know. So it's better to know
exactly,
than go.
exactly.
What's the expression I use? Is the devil, go with the devil you know versus the devil you don't know.
Yes, exactly.
So that's what I'm getting from what you're saying.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And it's paradoxical, but it really does make sense. And so when you become aware of what your pattern is, and then you want to bring consciousness into something that is a reflex, and you want it to go from the sort of place of reflex to the sphere of choice.
Okay.
And then you begin to have the choice to make different decisions. And that's where a lot of the work is. That kind of consciousness it doesn't have to be like leaving a partner or anything major. It can be as simple as exercising. For people with an insecure attachment, focusing on the self, making the self a priority is not something that was really privileged. So a lot of people feel like that dread to exercise. Oh no, I can't do it. I'd rather just sit here and chill. Why do I have to be responsible for myself? Why can't somebody do something for me? And so when you make a healthy decision and you bring those feelings with you and you go to the gym anyway, you will have an experience after that is different than if you didn't go.
Mm-hmm.
And you will have a more positive experience. And the same is true for food and cravings, becoming aware of our cravings, becoming noticing the relationship we have to certain kinds of foods. And when we become aware of that relationship, if we want to, we can make a choice to do something differently. When you start treating the self well, something happens and the world starts beginning to treat you well.
Well, I get it. I certainly am there. Having grown up somewhat of an avoidance style myself, I've changed a little bit as I go around. But the first thing that came to mind is I go back. I hope it's okay if I jump from theory to theory here.
Please. Yeah.
I go back to Brene, what I call the Debbie Ford method, and I remember her book, "The Dark Side of Light Chasers." One of the exercises is to say things that you don't like about, like if you don't like something, and the word "selfish" comes to mind for me. That's the one that was the hardest for me because being selfish was not something with the attachment style that I have. Selfish did not jive. And so,
Yeah.
is that something that you kind of work on with people to teach them to be selfish? Because I certainly do that.
Yes, I do. For people who are really over accommodators or are afraid to be selfish, I say to them, I mean, you have to appreciate this in context, but you need to increase your sadism and, decrease your masochism.
Yeah.
And I don't mean literally to be a sadist, obviously, but for a lot of people with an insecure attachment, there's a real fear of privileging the self and asking. There's a real anticipation that they're going to not only be said no to, but are going to be made to feel ashamed. And so, certainly practicing asserting oneself, knowing what one wants, what one needs, and asking for it. It sounds like a simple thing, the ability to say no.
Right.
These are all foreign territory for some people. And to practice that kind of stuff is fantastic.
And do you talk about some boundary issues? Do you talk about that stuff with people? Because I think that that's part of it too, right? Because I've seen many times people give, give, and give. And then they feel like as soon as the person is not receptive to their giving, then they're like, oh my God, they're going to leave me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's one of the main core things we want to help somebody take the risk of. And if a person does leave them because they've asked for something, it doesn't usually happen, but there are people when you change the contract with, they will leave because they have an investment in that kind of relationship where you're giving and they're receiving.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody doesn't have the room to give back, good riddance. I mean, it's not that simple, but it really is, right? And on the flip side of that, what people will find is that the world is not the same one that they grew up in as infants, and that when they do make room for themselves or try to make space for themselves, that people will have space for that, and the world will have space for that, and they won't have to. They often won't be abandoned, and so it's very important to try that out.
Yeah, not being abandoned is kind of like the fear that comes up right away if you want to leave someone, right?
Yes.
And I think that what I'm hearing also is that taking that risk, and I'm putting it in quotation marks here because is probably worth it. But how do we convince someone? Like I've had clients, and I'm sure you have
Yeah.
too, where you're like, oh my God, this is like the unhealthiest freaking relationship I've ever heard. How do we get them to move from that?
Yeah. Well, that's the work, and sometimes it takes a long time. And sometimes it takes for therapy, which is I mean, this is one of the things is what it often takes is a safe enough relationship and a deep enough therapeutic alliance so that the client really feels connected to you, the therapist, and is willing to take that risk and knows that they can come in with the feelings that emerge in them. That's a good sign.
And I think it's hard for some people to feel connected to your therapist. And one of the conversations I've had in regards to attachment also is that someone who has an anxious attachment, they'll bring that to therapy.
Yeah, that's right. Look, you can learn to change your style without therapy with a lot of hard work, but for most people, if it's kind of deeply ingrained, look, I've done it myself in therapy. I've done it as a therapist. Therapy is very helpful. And of course, we bring our anxious attachment and our issues of trust and our issues of shame. And hopefully, you're with a therapist who can notice those moments where you might be avoiding telling them something, or you may be pulling away because you've just had like an intimate moment and you now, don't show up the next week because, whatever. And you're able to talk about that stuff and work through that in the therapy. And that becomes, you have these new relational moments with a therapist. And those new relational moments give you an opportunity to have an experience that you never had before. Then you go out into the world and you sort of experiment with them out there.
Right.
That's ideally sort of how, in my mind, therapy works.
I like to think, and maybe you can tell me what you think, but I like to think that we mimic what a healthy relationship should be. And by sometimes that'll take, someone 6 weeks. They'll be like, all right, I'll open up. Some people take
Yeah,
6 months and some people take
yes,
6 years.
correct.
And I think that
That's
really
true.
depends on the attachment style. I don't know what you think about that, but I always tell people, like, being a sports fan, I work with a lot of males. We talk about sports sometimes, like, how is that therapy? I'm like, you don't have a clue how this is therapy.
Yes.
How do we also talk about that with people in the sense that they sometimes don't perceive it as building that relationship, so to speak?
Well, I don't know. I would think that some of the, like, for what you're saying, where you're able to bond and talk about sports, that something intimate is happening in those conversations. And based on how those conversations go, that patient is trusting you, understanding how your mind works, understanding where your empathy lies, and your humor is probably part of that. And I would imagine a patient experiencing that wouldn't question. I would think they would be having an experience with you that might be new
Right.
and might feel like it's providing them with those kinds of things in an implicit way. If they question that, I might just tell them that I think what we're doing here has all the components of the very things that you're talking about, but maybe talking about them explicitly is more frightening than just experiencing them without putting words to it. So maybe what we need to do is to put words to it and see how uncomfortable that might be for you.
Yeah. Being a Montrealer born and raised, I've been in the Boston area, Massachusetts area for over 23
Yeah.
years. And some of my clients, when we talk about hockey, what I tell them is that you developed empathy for the Montreal Canadiens. How screwed up is that? And so they're like, oh, yeah, I didn't notice that. And it's kind of like that stuff that I talk about too. Like,
Yeah.
how do you bring out that change in therapy? Bringing up that, especially with the attachment stuff, how do we bring up change with the client in regards to that? Because we definitely have our, I know I'm stoic about certain things in my therapy. I don't know how my therapist does it, but he brings down those barriers. Good for him. But how do we bring up change in therapy? Because that's really difficult. I think that's the hardest part of doing our jobs.
Yeah. That's a very good question. From my point of view, the change happens from working through these kinds of attachment styles with our patients and noticing when a person is retreating, noticing when somebody is shutting down, noticing a kind of emotion that may be in the body physically and kind of opening it up and talking about it. And as people begin to take the risks of opening up, because remember, the fear is if I focus on myself and I open up, these parts of me were made to feel that they were worthless. And these parts of me did not make me feel connected to people. And so by opening this stuff up, I'm pretty sure it's going to ruin the relationship. And when they begin to understand that, in fact, it's not only not going to ruin the relationship, but inside of that person is the genuine person who has every right to exist,
Right.
you know, and to flourish and to thrive. I mean, that's why this business is so, after 35 years, although you can get burned out and this and that, but it's a privilege to be able to kind of, you know, welcome parts of people and help hydrate those parts and help integrate those parts. And then to see them go out into the world and ask for a raise or say no to someone who has been inconsistently getting back to them while they're dating, and have that person who, by the way, who's inconsistently getting back, be shocked that the person is saying no,
Right.
is a wonderful thing to watch. And change, you know, happens. It can happen quickly or it can happen slowly. But the one thing is for sure, with change comes mourning. Person has to mourn what isn't, and they have to change their perspective also into inviting people who are caring and responsive and consistent. And that can be a challenge, believe it or not, because if you're not loved for yourself growing up, if somebody loves you, then something must be wrong with that person. So
Right.
you got to get through that. I don't want to be part of a club that would have me for its member, that old thing.
Yes, I remember that. It's who said that? Was it Benjamin Franklin?
I think it was Groucho Marx,
Groucho
but
Marx.
it might
Yes.
have been Benjamin Franklin before that.
Well, I always like that expression too because it's true, right? If you want me, the other thing I talk about with my clients, and it's a sign in my waiting room actually that says it takes at least 6 months to feel sustainable change.
Uh-huh.
And I think that that's probably, I can't remember where I found that stat. It's a real study. It's not like I made
Yes,
it up. But I think that
100%.
that's what I kind of remind people, like they might make changes fairly quickly, but then it doesn't stick because they got some pushback. And I say, yeah, that
Yeah,
might take 6 months before you're kind of like, oh no, screw it. I'm going to just stand up for myself.
yeah.
Do you kind of like have that conversation with your clients in regards to like change in how it may take time?
Yes, yes. I mean, there are people who come into therapy thinking that they'd like change to happen within a week. And, you know, you have to do some psychoeducation with people. And change does take time. I mean, we're building new muscles, we're building new synapses in the brain. You know, a lot of stuff has atrophied, and a lot of stuff has, there are these deeply ingrained patterns that one just repeats and repeats over time. Getting out of those deeply ingrained patterns is, it's work, and you have to respect that things take time and that new muscles need to be built. And you have to be consistently work at it. It's funny about the 6 months thing because I also, with my patients who are dating, I also tell them it takes 6 months to know who you're dating,
Yes.
and so, you can feel all these highs in the first 6 months, but it takes about that time to begin to see the character of the person that lies underneath a honeymoon period or things like that.
I think that that's exactly right. We can, what I tell people about dating in general is that I can make it myself look good for an hour. It's not that hard.
Exactly. Right.
Doing it for 6 months straight, that's a pretty hard thing to do. So,
It is.
yeah, definitely hard. I mean, does your book talk a little bit about dating and all that stuff? Because that would be
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Reset your romantic GPS, why you steer towards the wrong partners and how to change for the better is the name of the book. And it really was born out of my own desire to change my own attachment style. And it's a book really about becoming aware of our own attachment styles. It gives a lot of examples of different kinds of people, in different kinds of patterns. The one that the person who has to sort of conquer. And once they've conquered a person or the person loves them, then that person becomes less valuable. But while they're trying, they're just like, the most amazing partner. Once they get it, they then lose interest.
Right.
To people who, are sort of just serial monogamists, all sorts of different kinds of examples of kind of styles. And some of the consequences of not changing, the kind of tragedy of the thing about an insecurely attached person is that it has nothing to do with the person's essence. Like it has nothing to do with their potential. It's that kind of language was really superimposed on a person very, very early.
Okay.
And so the need to find security on an ongoing basis that lies outside of yourself can be so crippling because there's no ability to delay instant gratification for longer term satisfaction. There's no real ability to kind of figure out what would really be good for a person. They're just looking for security.
Right.
And they never are able to really fulfill their potential. They often feel pretty shitty about that, excuse the language, that they haven't been able to achieve like other people have achieved, all that kind of stuff. And the tragedy of that is it's got nothing to do with the essence of the person.
Right.
And so if you can unlearn what was learned, you get to have a life that lies outside of these constraints, and your experience of yourself changes dramatically. The more you can tolerate taking care of yourself, the more you can tolerate being good to yourself. I know that sounds ironic. And the more you like yourself, it's guaranteed that the world begins to hand you things that really show that the world likes you too.
Right.
Once you get it, once you see that, you don't want to let it down. You just naturally want that feeling. And it's terrific motivation.
And that's why I think for me personally, I take away when I talk to clients, I say, let's not play the comparison game because can always find someone who's doing better than me, and I can always find someone who's doing worse than
Oh,
me.
100%. Yeah.
And I tell people if you're hitting the 70 to 80% range, that's great. The stuff that I've always said about my therapy style, I'm like, I think I'm better than 70 to 80% of therapy. I have no problem being like, call me arrogant, call me whatever. I'm fine with that. That doesn't mean I can't improve, and that doesn't mean I'm the best. And I don't aim to be the best all the time, although I'll always look for improvement. So a little bit in the
Yeah.
relationship style that you talked about, that's also part of it. And one of the
Yeah.
ways to address it, my experience, is take away the instant gratification that you talked about.
Yeah.
And I think that that's how do we get people to shift that instant gratification? Because I think it's like that's what's missing, right? I think that's what people
Yes.
do.
Yes. If we can tolerate giving up the instant gratification, we're on our way. And so, look, for me, I think of it just simply as going to the gym. So I think of the treadmill as the dreadmill. You
Yes.
know, I would rather not. I get into moods where I just don't want to. I just want to chill and all this other stuff. And I know for the brain, forget about just working out for the body. 30 minutes of a cardiovascular exercise for the brain is one of the best antidepressants you can take. It's as good as an SSRI. I mean, maybe not as good, but it works the same way. You get blood to your brain,
Right.
and all of a sudden, for the next 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours, you feel significantly different. You also feel good about yourself because you've done something that you've dreaded, but you've done it anyway. You've been responsible to yourself. That little lesson
Hmm.
will go a long way because then you see it exists in other places too. Where else can I do something that I know I'd be foregoing instant gratification to experience a kind of longer term satisfaction? And if you can begin to do those things, you go to sleep, take your phone and put it on your night shelf 1 hour before going to bed. Don't look at it. Pick up a book. Let your brain rest for an hour. Stop looking for something to fill you up at the end of the night that you didn't have during the day. Live with that feeling. You begin to be the master of your choices. You begin to feel good about yourself. And you also get a better night's sleep.
I think it puts the bottom to the bottomless pit that we have.
Exactly. It stops that bottomless pit by bringing choice into the picture.
And I think that that's what most people have to understand is the choices.
Yeah. It's a lovely way. That's a lovely idea.
And I think it goes back to a little bit of what you said, like you talked about your book being the attachment style, and it's also about your own exploration of yourself. And you saw the choices that you had. Do you think that that's something that most people need to realize in order to move forward? Or
You mean to see that there are choices?
I think that what a lot of people say is that I don't have a choice. I'm going to talk for myself for a second. I'm 47. I better grab whoever comes around because I'm 47. I'm on the other side and I'm divorced and whatever. I don't believe that for the record. I'm just saying, for example, but once I saw that I had a choice, then I feel
Yes.
like I can respect where my attachment style is going to be more secure versus just be desperate about stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, I think that part of that choice also is noticing also, is there someone whom I'm saying no to who's actually who's actually very good for me?
right.
And being able to tell the difference between those two things. But yes, desperation really is, you want to have a relationship with desperation. You don't want to act on desperation. You want to talk to that desperation. You know that desperation comes from someplace. It's probably not from the here and now. The here and now, things might, you might want something, you might not want something, but that feeling of desperation comes from a child's experience that the world is hinging on your connection or disconnection from a parent. It's almost a life and death feeling. And so if you can talk to your desperation, right, and say, hey, what do you need right now? And then you sort of put your arm around that part of you. You talk to that part of you, show them around, show them your studio. Look, we got a studio. Look what else we got. We got this great podcast. That part begins to feel safer.
Right. And I think that that's what it comes down to in regards to relationships is feeling safe is key to a whole lot of people. And I think that tell me more about someone's going to pick up your book. I'm going to link it to my show notes, obviously. They pick up their book. Where are they going to get when they pick up your book?
They're going to be introduced to the idea of attachment styles. They're going to begin to kind of see examples of what it's like if you try to, as you change your style, what it's like if you don't, how we compensate for, how compensation comes into the package. And also different kinds of suggestions and techniques to begin to create that kind of consciousness that it takes around exercise and sleep and food and meditation. By the way, 5 minutes of mindful meditation is one of the most important things we can do. And it's one of the most important things we can do because it's 5 minutes of being with ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
of noticing when our minds have wandered and coming back to ourselves. And this idea of there's a self to come back to, for a lot of people, believe it or not, is an aha moment.
Right. I go back to mind, body, spirit that you talked about earlier. I think that it's important to be able to have all three. And again, I believe in spirituality personally.
Yeah.
And my practice of mindfulness or meditation or whatever people want to call it, taking those 5 minutes before bed. You talked about, putting your phone away. Well, for me, it's been my sleep hygiene. It's part of my sleep hygiene, including some sort of like 5 minutes on a cushion. That doesn't mean my mind's not wandering. I kind of remind
Right.
people, like, if your mind is not wandering, you should worry a little bit about that too. But it's
That's true.
realizing that you can do that. It makes a better relationship with yourself. And I'm happy that that's what your book is going to do.
Yeah. Thanks.
So where can we get your book?
So you can go to Amazon, and if you look up Marc Sholes or reset your romantic GPS, it pops up. And I have an Instagram, Marc Sholes LCSW,
Okay.
which is Instagram, and I have a website, which is marksholeslcsw.com. And I'm happy to, people ever want to reach out, help them, give them information on books or how to learn more about attachment style or how to find a good therapist, all that kind of thing.
And you're based out of Manhattan, right?
Yeah, I'm in Manhattan. Yeah.
And we didn't even get into this Yankees Red Sox stuff. But
That's good.
as we approach the hour already, because this went really fast,
Yeah.
the one thing that was very interesting to me is that at one point you were an associated director of editor, sorry, of Psychoanalytic Perspectives. Can you
Yeah.
tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, Psychoanalytic Perspectives is a journal, a psychoanalytic journal that, like a non-orthodox, a more kind of contemporary psychoanalytic journal. It's part of an institute called the National Institute for the Psychotherapies, that is a training institute in New York, and we train. So therapists and psychologists come to us, and they go through a 4-year program. And really, what they do is they learn to be deeper thinkers and just kind of learn more about how to be the best therapist they can be. That's really what a sort of psychoanalytic institute does. And that's been a great experience, training therapists. And COVID, as awful as it was, one of the things it did, which is great, is that it pushed mental health to the foreground. And boy, oh boy, are people more open to seeking out and reaching out for help. And that's been, the silver lining, one of the silver linings, at least in our business.
And I like that that the institute is not the orthodox, what people perceive as therapy. Like you lie on the couch and you start
Yes,
interpreting dreams, or a cigar represents a certain thing and a lake represents
exactly.
another thing. And I'm not going into stereotypes, but I kind of tell people,
Exactly. No, you're 100% right. No, it's therapy is a bi-directional, experience where people develop a relationship and are able to open up and talk and feel seen and feel heard and diminish shame, build self-esteem, and all the while, hopefully, the therapist is also changing from them a little bit and deepening their own empathy and appreciating their patient's own subjectivity.
I'm a big fan of psychoanalytic stuff. I used to be very much opposed. And I catch myself as I grow in my practice. And I know it's been 20 something years, but I
Yes.
use a lot more of those, what would we call them, theories, because they're very
Yeah.
solid. And,
Yeah.
I've become a big Jungian fan personally.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I love that stuff. So wanted to share.
Yeah.
But Marc, I can't tell you how much this was helpful. I hope people go buy your book because I'm going to definitely link that up. And attachment styles to me means the world because that is absolutely what we replicate as we get older. So,
Yeah.
so thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Steve.
Well, that concludes episode 91 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. Marc Sholes, thank you so much. It was a great conversation in regards to attachment styles and everything else that goes with that. So episode 92 will be a review of season 7. I can't believe we're already gone to the end of season 7. So I hope you join me then. Please like, subscribe, or follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for information, educational, and entertainment purposes. If you are struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor or therapist for consultation.